Hello and welcome to today's remote session. This is Tom Bechtold. I'm your host for today's program. Today we're going to be talking about the CISO update. Use automated data classification to meet CPRA obligations. And I want to say thank you to the folks over at Spirion for making today's remote session possible. So we've got a full lineup here, and I want to get into things right away, but I had a couple thoughts here really quick. The California Privacy Rights Act goes live at the end of the year. And there's a couple others that are following pretty close behind. Virginia and Colorado also have some similar laws that are coming into effect as well. And all of you security folks out there are so busy and you're already overstretched. And I'm wondering, how do you guys get your arms around all of these different laws? There's not really one-stop shopping when it comes to, hey, there's all these privacy laws coming out. How do I get my arms around this stuff, right? So I'm wondering, exactly how do you guys get this stuff done? So we brought in some experts today, and we want to see how, you guys can get some guidance from our experts. Because, they do say that you have to comply with all this stuff, but they don't say how to do it in an acceptable, measurable way, right? So again, we're going to talk about that today, and we're going to be talking about data classification and how this can actually help you stay compliant with these confusing privacy laws. They just are, unless you're a lawyer, and even in some cases, the lawyers are kind of confused about this stuff. So, and I see why. I mean, we're going to end up with 50 different privacy laws if we don't eventually get a federal one, right? So that being said, I'm going to get us going because you guys are actually here for the experts, not me. So let's get moving on. Real quick, our housekeeping. If you run into any problems, refresh your screen. F5 will generally fix any problems you might have if you don't see in the slides turn, you're having issues with us hearing us or things like that. If you have questions, we're taking them all throughout the program today. So I'm going to try to get them all at the end, but there are going to be some different points where I'll stop for questions. So please submit those when you have a chance. We'll do a certificate of attendance after about 50 minutes. So toward the end of the program, I'll give you a reminder about that toward the end as well. This is being recorded as well. So if you like what you're hearing today, come back and visit it or share it with a colleague. So we've also got a couple of great URLs and PDFs in the resource tab there for you to grab and follow along. There's a great white paper in there on data classification as well. So that being said, who are we talking to today? We have Mr. Scott Giordano. He is the VP of Corporate Privacy and General Counsel over at Spirion. Bridget Bratt, the Associate Director at Protivity. And Wally Bitote, VP Global Business Development at Seclor. So welcome, everybody. And at this point, I want to turn things over to Scott to give us kind of a level set on how things are going out there with, why data classification and the legal landscape right now, right? So Scott, the floor is yours, sir.
Wonderful, thank you. Here's an interesting thing about data classification, and this is something that has gone on since I've been involved with it probably for 7 to 8 years now, is that it's a very amorphous concept. I mean, if I ask 10 different people, what does data classification mean to you? It's going to mean 10 different things because it's just hard to visualize, at least it was for me anyway. And so we tend to think of data classification maybe in terms of military or Defense Department. So we think about something that's confidential or secret or top secret. In recent years, there's this idea of controlled unclassified information, which ironically became its own class of information, and I worked with that to a pretty big degree. So the net of it is that, and the reason we're here in large measure, I think, today is because this is just such an amorphous concept. We want to show how it really works in practice and how it can help advance your compliance with not just CPRA, but presumably just about anything. So without further ado, I want to dig a little deeper into the role of data classification. And just want to give a quasi-textbook definition of it for now. And it's a process, and I emphasize the word process, of analyzing, it could be a document, a file, a communication, and applying one or more labels that indicate control of that information. So things like who can access it, how long should it be protected, how long should it be retained, how long should it be disposed of, etc. And I use the word an underscore process because it involves regulations which beget policies, which beget expectations, and then get enforced by controls. And what you're going to find is that over time, the policies, expectations, controls all tend to iterate, revolve, or move, what have you. So that's something that it's going to be a moving target. It's going to be dynamic, and hence why I I'm very big on calling it a process, not just a project that you start and finish and you're done. Has to be repeatable and defensible, meaning that it has to work the same every time or it doesn't have a lot of value to it. One of the old jokes we used to have when I was at a defense contractor, and I was in the CISO's office a lot, and he loved to say, there's always a lawyer. And for better or for worse, there's always a lawyer because everything in this context needs a legal viewpoint to it to be able to say, yeah, that qualifies as something that should go into this class or that, what have you. But there's always legal, if you want, aspects to just everything. And it's remarkable, and that's become kind of an inside joke here. So that's the idea of the role of data classification. In terms of the why, it answers the kind of questions you would expect, especially if you've ever spent time in information governance. So where is it? What do you have? How is it controlled? How is it retained of? How is it disposed of? So all those things work in concert to follow your data as it goes through a life cycle. It creates consistency, and I keep hammering consistency because imagine that you had a data classification system that was not consistent and there was different controls that were being applied to the same data. It just create utter chaos. And it's something that wouldn't really help you in court if there was something that went wrong. And this is something I want to really emphasize, is that just because you lose track of data or lose data or something bad happens doesn't necessarily mean that you were negligent or that you weren't using what was reasonable under the circumstances. The bad guys could have just got the best of you, but being able to have a system that's consistent and shows that you're doing the same thing every time and you put thought into it, that's really what's going to win the day for you if you do wind up involved in litigation. Also, this enables you to justify and prioritize your controls. So you can look at, if say you have 4 categories of sensitive data, and you can say, well, for category 4, we believe that these controls are the most relevant, the most important, the ones we can enforce consistently, and as a consequence, we're going to prioritize budget and resources and effort for them. And then finally, in the event that there is a breach, or when there is a breach, depending on your point of view, and we're an internal investigation, it really helps you prioritize your efforts because you can run searches and get an idea of the kind of data that's in scope. So for example, say that, and this is something I work with every day, you may have 12-hour turnaround between the time you detect a breach and the time you contractually have to notify a partner. I'm far more afraid of business partners than I am of the government, and I am because they are much more demanding. Under GDPR, you've got 72 hours to notify the authorities. In many of the contracts that I'm involved in, you may have 12 hours, you may be the same day. The word usually comes up is immediately. So that should give you some indication of why being able to prioritize your efforts is so important. This system I've set up here, this is a very conceptual system of data classification. So you have the data classification matrix, which I'll show you in the next slide. You've probably seen before. The policy, so you have to write a policy that articulates how this thing gets used and who does it and who changes it and all those fun things that we all love about writing policies. You have the tools, the electronic tools like we use, not surprisingly, at Spiron, and then monitoring and audit. So the folks that are actually putting in the time and effort to go and monitor the tools and make sure that they're actually doing what we think they're doing. That's the model. It's worked very consistently over the years. And the first one, and the one I'm really going to talk about for this purpose here, is the matrix. And many of you have probably seen this if you visited any of my presentations over the last couple of years. This is based on a real one I developed some years ago when I was a defense contractor. And what it does is you have three tiers here. You have the severity of the consequence of mishandling the data. That's the middle. And as you get more severe, more significant, more adverse, whatever words you want to use, then that changes the nature of the controls that will be married to the particular kinds of data. And what you're going to find here that this has to be a function of how the real world works in your organization. So, and I'll give you a great example here. In column 3, which is the yellow column, you have, and you see there, attorney-client privilege materials are considered yellow, so tier 3. And you might say, gee, Scott, why are they not tier 4? Because that's something that if you lose, you can't get that back. You can't get the privilege materials back. And the answer is that if you look on the control summary on column 4, you'll find there's no transmission via fax. Well, here's the problem. Getting lawyers to stop using fax machines, at least at the time I wrote this, was impossible. And so I knew they were going to leave stuff on fax machines and fax to all kinds of places they shouldn't, and I couldn't get them to change things, so I just left one column, the sensitive material in question. So this really has to reflect the reality of your organization. It can't be something that exists on a shelf that's in it's theoretical. It's got to really work on a day-to-day basis. That's what this does, and it forces you to have that conversation with the legal and the compliance and the enforcement teams to say, yes, we can really use these controls. They really will work over time consistently. So let's map this to the CPRA, because this is presumably why you're all here. CPRA has this idea of a large data processor, so a business that collects more than 5 million consumers' personal information annually, and it asks them to conduct cybersecurity audits, to publish risk assessments. And notice when you see light blue in my slides here, it means you have to have a risk assessment or something of that kind. And then it also asks you to, and this is a positive mandate, meaning that you must do this, you shall implement reasonable security procedures and practices, hence why it's in red. That's the essence of CPRA. And I'll dig a little deeper on this. You have the CPRA and the CCPA regulations. As you probably all know, CCPA is live. The California Attorney General put together some regulations. They address different aspects, one of which, and probably the toughest for all of you, is going to be the verification of DSARs, meaning verifying that people are who they say they are when they say, I'd like all of my data, or I want my data destroyed, or what have you. So that's the idea. That's the fifth one there. That's going to be the one that you'll have the most trouble with, and so I do recommend you take a look at that. I understand there is a question floating in here. Let me see if I can go to the question box. If not, if someone can. Oh, okay, here we go. Yep. Do you utilize categorization subclassifications because the legacy 4 categories aren't operational? Yes, what you can do is you can either use a subclassification or just use a label. So say, for example, that you have something that's category 4, but you have quite literally subclassifications and you don't want to further divide your controls up or dilute your controls, then you can simply add labels to them and then subcategorize them that way. So, and that's how I did it. So say, for example, that you've got something that is pertaining to a particular set of clients, and you just simply label each client on the data that's in scope, and you can run reports and say, okay, we know that this is the data that's in scope. We want to be able to protect this with this control, and you map it that way. So the short answer is yes, absolutely, you can do that. I think this is my last slide, and so, yep, this is. This is one of the things I wanted to bring to your attention, and this was the CPRA contractual mandates. And you can see this is a bit of an eye chart here. The purpose of this is not to describe to you all the things you have to do on contractual mandates. It's really to describe the fact that you've got a lot of third-party intricacies with CPRA and with most privacy laws. And so you're going to find that that's a big challenge, and this is a good example of it. You can see that you have service providers, you have contractors, and you have third parties. Presumably, you could label documents service provider, contractor, third party, and be able to apply different controls to those kinds of documents. So again, a great example and a great way to subcategorize in a given category. That's what I have at the moment. I believe I'm going to be turning over to Bridget.
Great, thank you, Scott. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm going to talk a little bit about how to operationalize all of these really great things that Scott told you about, because sometimes that's where the rubber meets the road, and it's sometimes the hardest part. I'm currently Associate Director of Protivity in our Security and Privacy Data Identification and Protection. That is a mouthful, I know, but you'll see what we're talking about here in a minute. So what I want to talk to you all about first is, you know, it is a marathon and not a sprint. We say that about a lot of data programs, right? This is not a one and done. These are programs, right? These are things you really want to invest in and spend time on. You know, and when we talk about classification and then this upper right-hand quadrant, that's what we're going to focus on today. But I didn't want to leave out the entire, you know, end-to-end. Right? I want to show it in context of the entire picture. So really, the questions that are there, you know, does your organization formally classify your data? And then how do your users organize, classify data? And there are many ways, as you know, Scott alluded to classify data, right? There's content-based, there's context, there's user-based, right? And there's different ways. Those are some things you want to consider when you start thinking about how are we going to build a classification policy or standard, you know, to better understand our data. You know, what are those regulations, right? CPRA is a big one, right? CCPA was a big one. Now we have CPRA, and other states are coming in right under, you know, right under that. So how do you want to do these things? What is your definition of sensitive data in your environment, right? These are things you really want to understand first so that you can classify your data assets, and then you can really understand the landscape. And so when we talk about operationalizing data privacy in particular, again, we're going to focus here on these two middle boxes and really the data classification, right? So you want to define what matters, and then you need to classify, right, what matters. And, you know, and the longer you leave classified sensitive data, the bigger problem you're going to have. And your legal team is going to tell you, hey, that's defensible. We got to get rid of that. Do you not have a retention schedule? We got to get rid of that. That's out there. It's, you know, 20 years, somebody's going to come and ask us for something, and we don't really want it there. And if you're, you know, if you think about it, if your data is not classified, think of an incident response call, right? Think of an IRT. Think of something that happens, a breach, some sort of security incident, and you get on this IRT, and you know, and you're the CISO, and you say, oh my God, what did they get? What data did they compromise for us? And somebody's going to go, oh, I don't know. We don't really know. Nothing's really classified, so we don't actually know what was on that server or file share. That's going to be a very short call and a very, you know, stressful one, right? Because then you're going to be, you know, really kind of trying to figure out, oh, geez, what did we lose, right? And what of our clients' information did we lose? And that is, right, the crux of this, right, is really making sure you're not putting your clients' information out there, right, and in danger, especially from a privacy lens. So that, you know, that's something that we like to think about in the grand scheme of things. And finally, you know, the two, you know, there's a lot of words people don't like. Compliance is one of them. Governance and oversight are another couple, right? But, you know, like I said, data is a marathon. It's not a sprint. These are things that you really kind of have to, you know, really work on, right? These are things you have to continually go over, right? So, you know, just like in any tool where you're looking at false positives and you're looking at different things that come in, you really, policy standards, you know, you want to make sure you have these things in place. You want to make sure you know where all the data resides and that you've really classified that data, because at the end of the day, there's a lot of things that live and rest on classification of data, right? If that data is not classified in some way and you don't have a tier, you know, some sort of tiered approach to how your data exists, you really aren't going to know if you lose anything important, or you're really not going to know how to protect what's important at that point, right? You're going to be missing a lot of very fundamental things at the end. And I see we have a question from James. Do you have an example of a data classification standard that you're willing to share and aligning tool sets that utilize natural language processing? Right, so that's a really great question. And James, I definitely have a lot, probably more data classification standards than I'd like to have, standards and policies. And we do have things that will align with a tool set like Asperion, right, which does NLP, right, which will, you know, can do those sorts of things, right? So, you know, those are things that, you know, we can look into after this call. We can talk about the you know, kind of the functional, how do we get you those, you know, kind of that kind of information there. But that's a great question. You know, so to kind of wrap this up, you know, again, you know, you just want to think about this as those foundational pieces, right? If you want to meet your privacy regs, you want to meet any of your regs, you really have to know where your data is, what it is, define it, you know, and watch it, right? And make sure you can protect it. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it over finally to Wally.
Terrific, and thanks, Bridget, for that. So today what I'd like to do is introduce data-centric security, and in the context of today's session is really making discovery and classification tools actionable. And so what I like to always do is kind of do a little level set and kind of start with a big, what I like to call an aha moment as to what's driving the need for data-centric security. You know, when you think of the fact that we're leveraging, you know, cloud applications, you know, BYOD, shadow IT, mobile, work from home, the perimeter as we know it is gone, and that's the aha moment. Okay, so if I don't have a perimeter, what are my options, right? And when we kind of extend that to external collaboration, even if we try to perform certain things to protect and secure our data, by design, we're sharing sensitive data just to get our job done. And so, you know, traditionally we have approaches that are kind of what I'll call a means to an end. You know, we looked at, you know, classifying data and then discovering. I think we realized that, you know, manual classification just doesn't work. So now we kind of, you know, reverse the order. We discover and classify, and then what? You know, and the then what is really the actions now, what I like to call the power of two, and really blending discovery with data protection or enforcing the data handling systemically. And what this allows you to do as an organization is to move from what I'll call a reactive strategy. And a reactive strategy is discovering, reporting, alerting, and chasing your data, to a proactive strategy where you can discover and protect. And when we look at the integration with Spirion, this one simple use case at the endpoint, very, very simply, a user creates information on the desktop. Spirion performs its magic by scanning for keywords, patterns, classification tags, and so forth. And if there's a policy violation, the action becomes protection. We like to use seclure as a verb, seclure it. And now the information is protected anywhere it travels. And what we mean by protection is answering 4 questions about your data. The first is who? Are you the right user or group of users who can access the information? Once you pass muster, then what usage controls can you do with the information? Can you just view it, edit it, print it, copy and paste, to take screen grabs, share downstream? Very granular controls. Is time-based, and a great I think example is mergers and acquisitions. You know, you have a due diligence period where as the seller you're providing your financials, which you hope stay secure, but at the end of the due diligence period you'd like to see that information just disappear. So we have the concept of time bombing. And last but not least is location-based controls, which allows 2 things. One, it could be a use case where a CEO downloads board member notes to their tablet, not thinking necessarily about security. If that information ever left that tablet, it wouldn't be accessible by anyone. Or perhaps more from a GDPR, CPRA perspective, maybe you can open this document up in the EU, but not outside the EU. So we can create this geofencing capability. And all of these controls are on top of encryption. Encryption, as you might well know, is black or white. If I share something encrypted, I need to provide the encryption key in order to collaborate with that recipient. And once it's decrypted, I've lost all control of what the user's doing with the information, and I've lost all visibility. In this case, I continue to control. You can almost look at this as encryption on steroids. I continue to not only have it encrypted at rest in motion, but now in use, where I'm providing all of these granular capabilities, which are very persistent. So there's kind of 2 sides to data-centric security. One is this protection and enforcement of what we call the 4 Ws. And the second is the auditability. So anything that's protected is now completely auditable. So you can have high-level trend analysis of what's happening with your data. You can dig deep into forensic data about, who's accessing your data from what device, IP address, what are their access rights, and so on. And now it really provides the business with context as to how their information is used in a business context versus being abused in a SOC remediation context. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Tom.
Appreciate it. Thank you very much, Wally. So at this point, we're going to kind of shift gears. If you have any questions, please submit those in the Q&A box. I know we've gotten a couple so far, but now we're going to shift over to the questions that I have for our group. And just a reminder, we've got Bridget, Wally, and Scott here. So let's get into our first question. So the first one, I kind of want to go back to Scott. You had talked about reasonable security under the law. What does that mean? I mean, that is so ambiguous. Could you unpack that a little bit, Scott?
I would be delighted to, and to use your favorite attorney phrase, it depends. With that as a backdrop, about almost 6 years ago now, the California Attorney General's Office published what's called the California Data Breach Report. And what was interesting about this is they spoke very highly of the CSC Top 20. Formerly, it was the SANS Top 20, if you go back as far as I do on the information security world. But Top 20, an excellent framework, really, for protecting your environment. It's very well regarded. I know the SANS Institute actually has training on it several times a year. And so that was held out as a very good way to go. They also thought very highly of the ISO, the 27001-002. So the net of it is that they're not going to recommend one for you and say that if you use that, you're okay. What they're really going to do, and they being the courts or the regulatory agencies, are going to say, okay, what system did you pick? Was it role appropriate? So, for example, HIPAA, high-tech, there's ISO standards for that. There's other standards for that. And be able to say, okay, did you implement things that were appropriate for that? And how good of a job did you do? And can a third party vouch for you? Can a third party look at this and say, yes, they did a good job. It was reasonable under the circumstances. You do not have to be able to withstand an attack from a state actor. You can be reasonable and still be beat. So keep that in mind as well.
Yeah, you can still do everything right and then somehow get in trouble, right? Insider threat, for example. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay, excellent. Wally or Bridget, anything to add? Is there anything that you think that should be listed under as reasonable security?
I think that's a really great question. That's, because when CCPA first came out, one of the questions I would get consistently from clients and from folks is, what do they consider PII? I mean, I have cameras in my drive-through at my bank, and what about license plate numbers? And are we going to have to keep all that and do all this, right? So people were very concerned about what is reasonable, right? What am I reasonably supposed to do for this data? And, it really, to Scott's point, it really does depend on assessors, right, or external parties or auditors, right, that'll say, well, we think this is pretty reasonable, right? We do a lot of FFIEC exams, for example, and we talk to a lot of financial institutions, and we say, are you do we think you're protecting your data or doing what's reasonable, right, considering the size of your company, right, what you're trying to do, and I think that is, and it is difficult because it is ambiguous and it's different for everybody.
It's tough. It's tough. Like we said at the top of the program, it's daunting. It's a very daunting task. Okay, let's shift gears. Let's move to our next question. How do you address compliance needs when sensitive data is shared by design? This one, this sounds like a Wally question. Wally, what do you think about this?
Sure. So, let me start by saying what I see that's common across every industry, large or small, every vertical, is that there's three common general use cases. One is, data leakage. We have some amount of intellectual property, customer data, employee data we simply don't want leaked out. The second one is a little bit more cumbersome, which is the meat of this question, is the need to collaborate externally. In order for an organization to perform just their daily duties, there's a need to collaborate with the outside world. And by doing that, in many cases, we're sharing sensitive data. And then the last but not least is what I kind of call the alphabet soup, the 3- and 4-letter acronyms, which the compliance requirements that, depending on what vertical and industry I'm in, are going to ensure that I'm making my data safe and secure. And so typically the way that's been addressed is through what I'll call trust and legal controls, right? We have NDAs, together, and we have the ability to do vendor audits. So we hope that can cover our bases. And so from our perspective, in order to really meet compliance, as I stated earlier, we want to put the security in the data. So regardless of where it goes, how it's being shared, where it resides, it's always secure. And once it's secure, the enterprise is now in complete control. At any point in time, they know what's happening to their data. They can modify policies to their data. And probably the biggest one is the ultimate undo, right? They can revoke access to it, which fits many of these compliance requirements. And so, we believe that the silver bullet is data-centric security, so that we can move to a complete zero trust type of approach.
Excellent. Anything to add, Scott or Bridget?
Not for my part.
Yeah, I always have something to add. I always have something to add, Tom. I think Wally's right on.
Let's have it.
Well, we talk about data privacy, right, by design. We talk about privacy tech by design, right? These are things we talk about, and these are tools, right, that we talk about in those conversations. Because if you build in these privacy needs, right, I think as Wally was kind of saying, you're already there, right? You don't have to go back and add extra, right, security to it. knowing you have to share sensitive data because of the nature of your business, you're already building those things in as you're, thinking of what solutions you want to use within your environment. So I think that is a really smart way, right, to approach this, very different than I think what we used to do 10, 15 years ago.
It's a lot of things we used to do 10, 15 years ago that need to be reevaluated. Let's move on to our next one. Let's see here. How can contextual classification help meet regulatory obligations? That's a mouthful, and it sounds like a Protiviti type question if I ever heard one. Bridget, can you address this one for me?
Oh, I think this might be a Scott question, but
oh, is it really? Oh my God, it is a Scott question. Scott,
I will take
this is a lawyer question.
I will. I've just turned over the egg timer, folks, just so you know. So how can contextual classification help meet regulatory obligations? And really, it could be any obligation. It could be contractual, regulatory. It's the idea of taking what I showed you earlier, those 4 categories, and saying, okay, maybe I have 5, maybe I have 3 categories, but I'm going to look at the context of something. So say, for example, it's the sensitivity within a category. That's something that our technology does, and it's something that when it does that, it can apply a label and say, okay, according to this context, so we think that not only does it belong in this category, but these particular controls should apply. So it's the idea of having the automation part refined to a point where you have a lot of granularity in how you apply the controls, and it gives you a lot of flexibility as well. So if there are subcategories in a contract, for example, depending on the different gradations of things going bad, and so different controls need to be applied, different response times, different plans for data breach or for incident response, all those things can be baked in to contextual classification.
Interesting. Wally, you want to add anything? I know Bridget did.
No, I was punting that to Scott too, so I'm out. I got nothing.
Sounds good to me.
You're both going to get a bill at the end of this then.
Checks in the mail.
Send me one too. Why not?
Yeah, I'll send all 3 of you.
Okay, excellent. Let's move to our next topic. What are the most significant challenges when operationalizing a classification program? This one definitely sounds like a Bridget. So where are you seeing challenges here, Bridget?
And Scott can answer this too if he wants. I'm sure he sees them too. But I think the most significant challenge that we see when I talk to clients is, where do I start? It's overwhelming, right? I don't even know where do we begin. And a lot of times it is the information security folks that are coming to us, right? It's not the business, it's not legal and compliance, right? To talk about it, it's usually the technology folks, because even though classifying data really is a business function, right? Classification really is, the business saying, hey, this is our data, right? We own this data and it's important to us, and this is how we classify it. Technology ends up kind of taking the torch up because they take on all the risk, right? And information security, CISOs, they take on the risk and say, hey, well, if you're not going to tell me how to classify this data and what's important to you, then we're risk adverse, right? We're going to block everything, nothing's getting anywhere, and we're just going to lock it all down. And they, I think technology sees that there's a problem, but really, we get a lot of CISOs that say, well, how do I start a classification program? I'm not the business, right? I see why we need it and I see what it does, but I don't really know how do I get them involved, right? And that's where we need to come in and say it is an organizational problem, right? It's risk and compliance and privacy and legal and all your business areas, marketing and sales, but it's also your information security folks, right? And the like. So, everybody kind of has to have a seat at the table. So, the way to solve for this is really make sure you've got everybody there, right? And everybody kind of understands why this is important, and have a champion, have somebody that's really pushing this through to be important.
Gotcha. Scott, what do you have to add?
I would love to add a couple points. One point is that I absolutely agree that it can be overwhelming, and I get the same question, where do I start? Remember the 80-20 rule? It has served me very well. 20% of the systems in scope have about 80% of the data you care about. Okay, that's been my experience just throughout my career. So I would identify those 20% of the systems and then say, okay, let's do a pilot project. And yes, let's get everyone in the room. And this was a revelation for me, is that included folks from overseas. If you're a multinational, getting your overseas folks involved in the room, either virtually or however, to be able to have a say in how these things get done, that changed everything. I got a lot of buy-in because we included them. And as a consequence, the data classification schema went a lot better just because everyone got to weigh in. So I want to echo what was said earlier, get everyone in the room, virtually or otherwise, and use the 80-20 rule, and that will get you going.
You have to be careful because sometimes the 80-20 rule, though, is also 20, or what is it, 20% of the people do most of the work?
Well, yes, that's true. That's true in any environment. So,
right. Wally, you were going to say something. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to add a little twist. I think, it's always the question, where do I start? Our view is more of where do you end, right? What's the end game? And I think it's something that we don't think about enough. And I think many of us aren't familiar with data-centric security. But if you think of the context, if my end game is to ultimately protect my data, how do I get there? And so that's what I would just view it as, is let's make sure we look at this in a broader scope and understand what the ultimate end game is for this project.
Yeah, you kind of need to know what victory looks like, right? So that's very important. Good stuff. Okay, let's move on. Okay, what hurdles do users face when adding additional layers of security? Wally, why don't you kick us off here? What are you seeing?
Yep. Yeah, so I mean, this is always the challenge between the balance of security versus usability, right? Because if it's not usable, then this just simply won't get adopted and business flows stop. So, when I think about the context of, discovery, collaboration, unstructured data, there's kind of three concepts that we need to think about. One is the protection side, the second is the consumption side, and the third is the usability side. And what I mean by protection is who's making that determination? I mean, when am I going to figure out what should I do to protect this and who should have access and what rights? So number one, to take that hurdle away is you take the user out of the equation, right? So you simply automate it. So that's out of the way. So the second one is the consumption. Now, when someone's receiving something that's got this security layer around it, we need to ensure that it's transparent, that they don't have to install any agents or any plugins of any kind. They can just use a browser, and they'll have complete controls that the enterprise can still dictate what's happening to that data that's now left the enterprise walls. And then lastly is the usage. And what typically happens is, policies might be placed on content that's being shared, and that policy says, you and I, Tom, and Bridget are collaborating on this document. But I need to add Scott into the picture. Well, if my policy doesn't have Scott, then I have to go to my administrators to add Scott to this picture. And so when you think of traditional tools like Microsoft's AIP, I mean, they simply can't handle that very simple everyday use case. So you need the ability to provide ad hoc collaboration on an as-needed basis. And so in my mind, to get past these hurdles, you remove the user for protecting, you make it very simple for someone to consume the protected content with complete transparency, and they can continue to leverage and perform their daily tasks without any intervention from administrators or others.
Do you get pushback when people, you go in and you say, hey, we're going to automate all this stuff? Do people ever get like any kind of pushback with like you're disrupting their processes, things like that? How do you overcome that kind of stuff? Or we've always done it this way, and now you're coming in with this great. It sounds like a great idea, right? But how do you I guess calm that?
Well, I think it's fairly simple in that what enterprise determine, especially if they performed manual classification, is that this simply doesn't scale. I mean, how do I get all my users, especially in enterprises with tens of thousands of folks, to do it the same way and to do it the same way every day? And I think there was some comment by Scott early on, we need consistency in all this for this to work. And so when you get into automation, now you're bringing across consistency to the process.
time savings should also help, right? Yeah.
Scaling,
okay.
Sure.
Excellent. Okay, let's shift to our next question. And out there in the audience, I'm actually curious, for the folks that are kind of just starting out with data classification, how did you get started? I'm curious, we asked our experts here what they would recommend. I'm curious what some of you have done. Is there certain frameworks that you guys looked at? What were you guys doing? Throw something in the Q&A. Just kind of curious myself what you guys are thinking about out there. So throw something in there if you wouldn't mind. Let's see here. And so kind of I'm going to keep with you, Wally, here. How do you ensure that the data is protected in that consistent, scalable manner like we just kind of talked about?
This
like an example for that?
Yeah, so certainly this dovetails to everything we were just talking about. I mean, automation is the only way to make this scalable and consistent. And what we're finding too is that data-centric security as an action coming out of a discovery tool, so Spirion discovers the data, and when it sees a information that it looks like it's sensitive of nature, simply secure it, protect it. And what happens is that data-centric security provides a lot of leniency to how we build our rules. And that's usually where there's a time suck, right? We're trying to work by decisions by committee as to what's important, and then based on what's important, what's the data handling instructions. And so the leniency comes in is that if Spirion finds out that this is highly sensitive, confidential, you protect it with a policy. If it's sensitive or it looks like it has some information that could be sensitive, protect it. And if you're in this gray area, what's the worst case? You protect it. And so all of a sudden the business rules become much easier and protection almost becomes a default. And it can become a default as long as it doesn't affect any of the downstream users. It's got to be, as I mentioned, transparent, easy to use, as if it doesn't even exist, but the controls are all there. So that's really, in my mind, how you make it scalable and consistent is through this automation and the leniency that data-centric security provides.
Sounds good. Bridget or Scott, anything to add?
Nothing on my part.
Okay, sounds good. Just make sure. Let's see, we have any audience questions on this? No? Okay. Again, if you have any questions for us, let us know. We'll get to those in just a few minutes. Okay, one more question here. Let's see here. How does a foundational data discovery and classification program mitigate risk and keep with compliance? Bridget, you want to tackle this one?
I can. I think we've talked a lot about this already, but just to kind of go into a little more detail of this in particular, risk is ultimately, kind of, I always say, is the stealer of things, right? Risk is the one that's always out there, and every company has a different level of risk, and every department in the company has a different, risk tolerance, right? But really, discovery and classification, what that ends up happening is you've discovered your data, you know where it is, and you've classified it. So you know exactly what you have and where it is. So then it becomes, okay, great, now we can protect it. To Wally's point, now we can protect it the way it needs to be protected. Now we know that if it's privacy data and it's a customer's, social security number, it's customer data, now we know we're going to be in compliance, right, with our regulations, our privacy regs, and other things, HIPAA, and all of that, to say, great, now we know, right, what we need to do. And I think it helps keep companies on track to at least know, you did your due diligence, you know what you have, and you know what you have to do to be compliant. And then I think that just helps, overall, that's going to mitigate your risk, right, once you know all that.
How often would you recommend going in and adjusting, your program? I guess is there like a set in stone, or how often should you be adjusting?
I think in my experience, I think if you do the work up front and you really understand, you really define what sensitive data is to your environment and to your company, and you really define all of those things, and you say, okay, these are the kinds of labels we want. This is how we want to classify. These are our tiers, right, that we want to use, as seen that in Scott's presentation early on. This is how we want to classify it. That should stay pretty, pretty stagnant because unless something comes out, right, like CPRA, where now maybe things have changed a little bit, or you have a new requirement, new regulation, you know, you don't want to change that very often because you want to build a culture of data, right? And to do that, that means don't be changing things all the time. And I think Wally said this too. You know, data-centric organizations build a culture of data, right? They have good governance, they have stewards, right? They have all those things. And you really want to keep those, you know, pretty well defined and not changing. So I would say, you know, you want to look at it anytime a new reg comes into the mix, or if you have a lot of M&A, you bring a new type of company in your mix, take a look at it. You may need to change it, but, you know, you want to keep it fairly static.
Good to know. Good to know. Appreciate that. Okay. Anybody else to add?
Sure, I'll jump in here. One of the interesting things that I've studied, and I typically do a review at least once a year of all of the GDPR fines and penalties that happened in the previous 12 months. And what's fascinating is that in a plurality of cases, the data that was stolen or corrupted or what have you was data that the victim didn't even know they had or didn't know why they had it. And that's remarkable when you think about it, that a company doesn't even know why they have someone's personal data, for example. And so by being able to have a very good idea of what kind of data you have, where it is, how sensitive it is, what are the implications of losing control of that data, when you have that to a very highly refined abstraction, then it's a lot easier to mitigate risk because you know exactly where to point the controls and where controls really aren't going to help you very much, or where you're just layering on things that look nice but really don't have a lot of effectiveness. So the net of it is that the more you know, the better you can mitigate risk.
That is great. That is a great point, and that is definitely something the legal teams are always, you know, talking to us about is, you know, we have data we don't know we have, and it's really, you know, very important data, and it's sitting out there. And how do we not know that, right? And why do we not have better retention policies and schedules around those things? But I think it's actionable, right? I think a lot of these things are policy, right? And you get people say, oh yeah, we have a policy for that. It's like, okay, well, is it just a piece of paper? Oh yeah, it's just a piece of paper, right? So these tools, you know, that kind of, you know, we're talking about here really help action those things, right? They make it more actionable where you actually can see what is, you know, really, really old data that shouldn't be out there. And here's what you need to do to get rid of it, right? Here's how you archive it off. Here's how you know, if you want to de-identify it, whatever you need to do to get it away and out of a situation where it could be compromised. You know, and I think that's where a lot of folks end up struggling is, you know, yeah, we have all these policies and standards and they're wonderful and they're great and they're all sitting out in our drive, but, you know, nobody's actually labeling anything, right, or classifying anything. So I think that's the tough part.
Got a question that just came in. I'm just going to throw this one out to the group. Anybody feel free to go for it. I'm not a technical person, so I might butcher this. Me too. I feel for you. How does classification and CPRA apply to a business function that collects data from forms to sell to others, and we never view the data? It's like encrypted or something. What do you guys think about that? It's the one from Lauren in there.
Okay, I'll take the first stab at it. It's interesting because this is not unlike PCI DSS, where maybe you're using a gateway, and so in principle you're never seeing the data. It's literally being sent off to a gateway, and as a practical matter, you shouldn't have to comply with PCI DSS, but there's still some compliance requirements. I think that's the analogy I would draw if I was trying to minimize the controls I had to put in place, was that, hey, we never see the data. We shunt it off to this other channel, and therefore, in terms of CPRA compliance, we're already compliant based upon this control. It's almost like a privacy or security by design control. You've just designed it so you can never see the data, even if you want it to. Almost like encryption, if you give the encryption keys to your customer and there's no way for you to recover them, then that's another example of security by design.
Gotcha. Okay, appreciate it. Thank you. Anybody else want to add to that one? Okay. Thank you, Lauren. Appreciate that. Okay, let's go to our next question here. What is the relationship between classification and policy enforcement? Scott, why don't you start us off on this one?
Sure. I mean, classification is a tool of policy enforcement. You remember the bullseye that I shared with you earlier on, where at the core is the matrix or the schema or whatever you want to call it. It's the relationship between the nature of the data you have and the controls you have in place. Yep, that's it. So you've got that matrix, then you've got the policy that wraps around it. So the policy is going to be using the matrix to advance whatever goals it has that are being drawn from regulations. So that's the relationship among those three. And within the matrix, there's going to be the nature of the matrix to serve expectations. So there's an expectation, for example, that data that's in a certain form, maybe if it's on a hard drive, will be destroyed in a certain way if it has a certain classification. It's going to get crypto shredded if it's on a cloud server or what have you. But the idea is that at that level of granularity, you already know exactly what you're going to do. The policy tells you what you're going to do, and your tools push that, literally pushing the electrons around, and that's all being driven at the top level by the regulation.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Anybody? Wally, you want to add on to this?
Yeah, I mean, mine is more from kind of the technical aspect and the ability to really map classification tags to specific policies that perform what I like to refer to as the end game, right? Which is protecting your data and ensuring that it's always protected regardless of how it travels, where it resides, the ability to audit the data once it's protected, and the ultimate undo function and revocability.
Gotcha. Thank you. And Bridget, anything?
No, I think Wally and Scott did a great job.
I think so too. Excellent. Okay, let's shift gears. We're kind of getting down to the end of our program here today, but I told each of our presenters, if they wouldn't mind, to give you guys some homework. What's something that you guys can start doing now to kind of get your arms around data classification, making sure you're kind of getting your head around some of these privacy laws too. So let's start off with Bridget. Bridget, what do you have? What kind of homework assignment would you assign today?
So I would actually say that you could go into your organization, right? Verify that you do have an operational data classification policy. You have some tiers outlined and defined, that you have a good retention policy and schedule, that they exist. And funnily enough, then I would say apply the 80-20 rule to Scott's point, right? Go, think about where you probably know where a majority of your riskiest and most sensitive data probably lives, and start there and, do some discovery and then do some classifying of the data, in that space, at least to give you a representative sample, right? Or if you don't know, and you have no idea that maybe you've got sensitive data spread all over, right? Then you could do, kind of a more of a broad, sweep of a discovery and classification. But, those are things you can do to just kind of get started on understanding how big is my problem, right? How much data do I have out there that I don't know about, and, that kind of thing. So I think that'll be, a good place to start.
Sounds good. Wally, what's your homework?
Yeah, I think from my perspective, I would say take a look at your end game, and the ability to ultimately protect your data, in my mind, is your end game. And so now that you have hopefully a much better understanding of what data-centric security can do for your information, is to take a look at whether you have a project that's completed already with classification and discovery as to what protection can provide, or more importantly, if you're just starting that trek, how can you blend those technologies together to meet your end game in a much more expedited fashion.
Excellent. And over to Scott. Last but not least, the lawyer gets to go.
And gets the last word, or at least almost.
That's right.
What's I think important here is that being able to go and talk to the business and technical owners of the systems that you're going to be taking a deep dive into. Some years ago, I did a project reviewing a CRM system, and one of the surprises I found is that when I was interviewing the business owner, is that at the time, the CRM system has data fields where you can just put free text in. And not surprisingly, people would put all kinds of stuff about customers because this was before GDPR went online. Once it went online, then suddenly customers could access that. And you can imagine all of the bad PR you might get from reading some of these entries. So to avoid those surprises, it's really important to go and interview the people that run these systems because they can tell you where all the dirt is, if you will, and it really helps you when you start building out a larger program.
That reminds me of a story from years ago. I won't say the company names or anything like that, but something very similar did happen with the CRM system. So very funny, interesting. God, I forgot about that life. That was 15 years ago. Thanks, Scott. Gives me something to ponder later. Appreciate it, everybody. Really, just great job. Good information. Good kudos from the audience in there, too, from the comments that I'm seeing here. So thank you, Bridget, Wally, and Scott for taking the time and sharing your expertise with our crowd today. Really appreciate that. We've got more stuff on the way. Later this week, we've got BEC, the FBI, and the 2021 IC3 report. Some good stuff coming out of there. Devil in the details. Isn't that just always the case, right? Why legacy breach and attack simulation falls short. That's coming up toward the end of the month. May 3rd, we've got how to shape security behavior and build sustainable habits. Injection vulnerabilities happening on May 5th. Safeguarding communications between applications and machine identity automation. That's May 17th. And actually noticing there's a couple that we're missing in here that are actually in May as well. So you might check the website for the most up-to-date. And then in June, we've got evolve from risk management to risk intelligence. So lots of stuff coming up in the near future. So take a look at that resource tab. You can actually register for all or any of those at the same time. So take a look there. I want to say thank you again to the folks over at Spirion for making today's session possible. This concludes our CISO update. Use automated data classification for CPRA obligations. So thank you all for joining us. This concludes today's remote session. We'll see you on the next round.